When it comes to firepower, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has no shortage of guns to get the job done, but with some slight changes to the gearbox formula, I think there's some things we need to talk about. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, welcome back to Legacy Gaming. Today, we're diving into Wonderlands and breaking down how each gun's elemental damage type plays a huge impact on your game. If you're a veteran Borderlands player, a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be familiar, but if you're new to Wonderlands or Gearbox games in general, this is an absolute crucial component to understanding their games. What I'm talking about are elemental damage multipliers. These are determined by your gun's elemental damage type and the enemies that you're using them on, and because there are a few changes to the formula, I think it's worth breaking it all down for you to understand. Before we talk about the weapons themselves, let's bring you quickly up to speed on the types of enemies in the game. Because this is a fantasy game, things look a little different than the post-apocalyptic stylings of the Borderlands series, and as such, the types of enemies have changed slightly. Enemies with red health bars indicate flesh enemies, usually assassins, pirates, and any other creature with skin, for the most part. Enemies with yellow health bars have armor. This is easy enough to spot visually as they are often labeled as badass enemies, indicating a tougher foe. Enemies with blue health bars have ward, the same as the player. These are shields that need to be dealt with before taking down the enemy's actual health pool. Finally, gray health bars indicate bone enemies. As you'd imagine, this is what you'll have to deal with when fighting against the armada of skeletons the Dragon Lord throws your way. Those are the 4 types of enemy health pools within the game, and with that out of the way, let's shift our attention and talk about the guns themselves. First, let's tackle physical weapons. These are guns without any elemental statuses tied to them, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Gun manufacturers like Hyperius and Dahlia are what we're talking about in most cases, as their guns focus more on traditional gunplay than on some of the more fantastical varieties within the game. The good news is physical damage does 100% damage to all enemy types. That means flesh, armor, ward, and bone will all take the full amount of damage from any of these guns. Now, in my opinion, it's always nice to have one of these types of weapons in your back pocket. Not only do they provide you with 100% damage no matter the enemy type, these weapons are also usually easy to fire and have relatively high damage per bullet. The real drawback is there's nothing flashy here, and you're not going to get any extra benefits by using a physical weapon, but they're far from useless. Next up, let's talk about Dark Magic Weapon. These are a new variety in Gearbox's world, and as such, I thought it'd be fun to talk about these next. Dark Magic weapons are weaker than every other elemental type in the game, and they have a 90% multiplier no matter the enemy type. The catch, however, is that these weapons have a chance dictated by the weapon themselves to restore health on hit. And this is crazy if you think about the build potential and the possible sustain you could have from a Dark Magic weapon. Now, I have not been lucky enough to actually find one that I really enjoy, but I did use Dark Magic guns a fair bit during my campaign playthrough, especially when I was struggling to find a good ward. I think these are going to play a big part in some cutting-edge builds. It's just a matter of really working them in to make the most of their one drawback, that reduced damage. I'm keeping my eyes out for a legendary Dark Magic weapon that really sells me on the concept, but I see the incredible value nonetheless. Tapping into more traditional Gearbox roots, let's talk about fire weapons. These are some of my favorite in the game, mainly because of their high base damage plus high dot damage. In fact, I managed to get my hands on a legendary Hyperius SMG early on in my playthrough, and that thing just melted enemies all the way up and through the endgame. The key with fire weapons is their ability to take on fleshy enemies. Fire weapons have a 125% damage multiplier against those enemies, but they fall short in other categories, only doing 95% damage to armor and ward enemies, and depending on your difficulty, far less damage to bone enemies. This is why the game gives you multiple gun slots so you can toggle between weapons with different capabilities. When playing on the hardest difficulty, Intense, what weapon type you use against what enemy matters a whole lot more, and as you can see, in this case, fire versus bone is a losing matchup. Moving right along to poison, much like corrosive weapons in Borderlands, these are best when dealing with armored enemies. The matchup is great with a 125% multiplier, and considering that armored enemies are often badass or elite, having a poison weapon in your back pocket is pretty essential if you hope to survive in the Wonderlands. Poison weapons deal 95% damage to flesh and bone, but their real drawback is ward, and again, based on the difficulty, your poison weapons will have varying degrees of success. Throughout my 40-ish hours with the game ahead of launch, I found that poison weapons were very situational and really only got brought out when I needed to melt some armor. This will all be dictated by what legendaries you get as you play the game, but I never felt like poison weapons were my go-to. Next up, we have an old favorite, lightning weapons. These are incredible at taking out wards, boasting a 175% damage multiplier, making them almost essential carries throughout the entire game. No other multiplier gets that high, and with warded enemies everywhere, it's a staple of any build, regardless of what class you are in the game. Lightning weapons are also decent at taking on flesh and bone enemies with a 95% multiplier, which is why lightning weapons were often my second choice when it comes to killing enemies. While it does struggle against armored enemies, I found that it hardly mattered since those were a bit more rare than warded foes. I was lucky enough to get some great epic lightning weapons throughout my first playthrough that really became a staple of my progression. The weapon type cuts through wards like butter and manages to be effective against other common enemy types, flesh and bone, which makes lightning one of the most valuable elemental damage types in the game. Finally, let's talk about frost damage. I really love the idea of having weapons that slow enemies down, but there is a small issue here. Frost weapons deal 115% damage to bone enemies, which is great. There are plenty of levels in Wonderlands where skeletons are your main enemies, but the real issue here is the lack of damage against flesh enemies, which are far more abundant in Tiny Tina's magical worlds. Again, you have 4 weapon slots, which means flexibility, so having a frost weapon is good. Just realize it's got a serious drawback. Frost weapons are also decent at dealing damage to armored and warded enemies, which make them an okay pick if you understand that you really should never use them against flesh enemies. I really want to put a point on that because flesh enemies are the most common enemy type you'll run across in the game, and as such, you should be aware that a frost to flesh matchup isn't ideal. In fact, you're working against yourself. That being said, having the ability to physically slow enemies down is great, and you should always be on the lookout for a solid frost weapon. As I've mentioned a few times now, you'll eventually have 4 weapon slots, which means you can slot 4 guns at any one time, but also consider your spell slot as an additional source of elemental damage. The same multipliers apply here as they do with guns, and you need to keep that in mind. Say you don't have a great lightning weapon, but you have an awesome lightning spell. Well, now you have a surefire way to deal damage to warded enemies. Most spells are on a much shorter cooldown than the grenades were in Borderlands, which means you should actively be thinking about how to work them into your build and your playstyle. Having options to tackle any type of enemy is just as important as the weapons themselves, which is why evaluating your inventory before any major encounter and making necessary changes is a key part of the Wonderlands experience. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of how elemental damage multipliers work in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. With a firm grasp of these concepts, I have no doubt you'll be shooting and slashing your way across the Wonderlands with ease. As always, if you appreciate guides that get straight to the point and don't waste your time, we'd love your support. Hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing so you never miss a new video. You can also join us on Discord. We have a small section dedicated just for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and we'd love to have you join our community of over 20,000 members. Finally, if you like what we're doing here on the channel and you want to support us even more, you can do so by becoming a member. For just a few bucks, you're helping Livid and I achieve our dreams of becoming full-time content creators. Check out the join button below to learn more. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.